So I'll intro myself shortly, but today's going to be really focused in on that individual development planning piece and how we as coaches or even just technical leaders can support a player's journey in that process and really making it more about them and less about us, the coach, and a coach-driven process. So a bit about me. Born and raised in Toronto, son to Portuguese immigrants, so I'm first-generation Canadian. My education, I kind of knew around 16, 17 that I wanted to focus in on being in the sport of football, soccer. So my education was focused on kinesiology and health sciences. Finished that degree right out of high school, straight through. Recently looking at taking a master's in high performance coaching and technical leadership. Got accepted for that just last week, actually. So that's been a positive highlight. I'm looking forward to doing that over the next few years and continuing my learning. As for coaching education specifically and experience, started back in 2007, so I've been doing it for over 13 years now, and my experience has taken me across a number of countries that you see listed there. I won't bore you by listing them off, but education highlight right now is UEFA A license, looking towards a UEFA Pro, targeted Portugal, and I've completed 3 or 4 licenses here in Canada with the National B Children's and Youth license as well. Ontario Soccer, I've been with a governing body now since 2017. Had different roles in player development and high performance as a regional manager. I've also worn different hats with different projects as a performance analyst, a scout, coach educator. At one point, I was even a match official, so the experience bleeds across all facets of the sport. COVID posed some challenges, so furloughed a lot of staff, and I back in March of 2020, and a year later I had the opportunity to come back in a different capacity, and now I'm the manager of coach education, player development, and club licensing. Quite the mouthful, not intended to be something for one person, but hopefully we can grow out of this and bounce back into having more staff on board to help deliver these programs. But enough about me. I want to throw this right onto you. If you can just log in there onto that menti.com website, the links, just the instructions there at the top, type in the code that you see, and just let me know what age band of players you're currently or most recently worked with. So if COVID's posed some challenges and you're on pause right now, just let me know what group you were working with previously. This will help me kind of focus the presentation. Give you about a minute to get that in. If any information's coming in.
Matt, for the guys on their phones,
Yeah.
I'll just ask them if they could just drop it in the chat if they can't switch to see this. But yeah, we've got the website up as well.
Brilliant. So is the chat lining up with what you see there?
So we've got under 16, under 7, under 4 to under 19.
That's brilliant. Thanks for that one. Broad spectrum. Okay, so it seems like we're a little bit more in the youth setup towards the senior. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that in mind, then I'm going to keep that going. That gives me a good idea. So jumping in here into development planning, knowing now a little bit more about the audience here. So what's behind the curtain here? First thing I think is important for us to capture is why. Why would we do this? Why is individual development planning really important and part of the coaching process? So there's a few areas I want to draw some attention to. First one is it really allows us to gauge where we can focus our attention and energy and focus on what really matters to the player and to the team as a whole, but focusing on that individual piece to drive that team component. Another thing that's going to come out of this is you're going to help build your transferable skills for your players, for your athletes. These are things that they're going to be able to take with them, not just through their journey as a footballer in your side or in their future careers, but also into other aspects of their life, and then whether it be education or future career opportunities as well, but maybe outside the sport. Another one for us, it allows us to drive culture of accountability because things are measurable, they're more out there, and you'll see how exactly it all fits. We'll be able to create that culture where we can hold athletes accountable, but it also allows them to hold us accountable to certain standards and certain commitments that we'll make to helping them through this process. And as you do this over time, you're going to start building legacy data. So part of what we'll talk about is, for example, a self-assessment piece. But as you have legacy data, you'll have the individual development plans of previous years, previous seasons that you can lean on and use to build the next season's plan. So some key information that you have to be aware of as a coach or a technical leader in this area before you really dive and develop your individual development plans and what that will look like. You have to keep in mind these 6 pillars here. The DNA and identity is really important. What's your club's mission, vision, values? Are they a recreational-based club that's going to focus a lot more on participation of players, just getting as many as possible for as long as possible? Or are you working at a professional academy which are driving more performance metrics and it's about graduating players to higher levels of the game? This is going to impact how you structure this process. Game model. How do you want the game to be played? Are you looking at a very direct style of play? Are you looking at your branded tiki-taka style of play? Looking at, for example, clubs like Red Bull or Ajax or Barcelona, very defined structures and how they view the game. What does your club look at? And if they don't have one, what do you as a coach define as a philosophy? Curriculum. This is going to depend on age stage. So there's going to be a blend of learning and performance-based outcomes. If you're working with grassroots players, it'll lean towards learning-based outcomes. If dealing with youth, like most of you are, towards the senior, it'll lean towards more performance, but there's still some learning elements, especially in the youth sides, you have to be aware of when you're designing what you're trying to get across to them over the course of the season. The season plan, this looks more at the program from a younger side. So what training days, competition days, looking at a calendar almost in this area and what other events come in. If with the older groups, you're looking at periodization, so structuring it, making sure it's loaded correctly, that the players are not emotionally, but also physically loaded in the right ways to avoid injuries and maximize their performance. Coaching methodology. How do you operate as a coach? Are you proactive in your session design? So are you working towards the outcomes you've defined in your curriculum, independent of what you're seeing in the performances at matches or competitions? Or are you reactive? Are you looking at the performance in a given competition day and building your session plans in reaction to what you see there? Also, in terms of the session building style, is it progressive? Do you build in complexity and intensity within your session, or are you looking at a whole part whole or a game activity game method? There's key questions to keep in mind as you work through your individual development plan structure. And the last bit is what's your leadership style like? How do you intervene within a session? How do you intervene even outside a session, implementing some of the expectations you might have for the team? Are you transformational in approach, autocratic, authoritative? These are some self-awareness pieces which will be critical. But ask these questions of your club. If they don't have something, you may be able to start that conversation about talking to build some of these pieces. So diving in a little bit more into the curriculum, which is going to tie more intimately to the individual development planning, you have to look at age stage priorities. So most of you aren't in the grassroots, so I won't spend too much time here. It's an example here from Ontario Soccer and how they prioritize certain skill sets or certain behaviors based on their age and development stage. But you may have a curriculum design, and here's an example of one that I used years ago. Probably would adjust it a lot, but being transparent, this is something I used years ago. It looked much more from a skill acquisition approach to it, but everything was timed. So we had our windows for working on specific skills, how they intermingled. It was holistic, so there were psychological skills that were built in. You'll see at the bottom left in psychological, the goal setting, and that's where the individual development plan piece was important. And you'll see it again in the middle and again at the end. And I'll give some more context to that as we go. Season planning, this is probably where majority of you are. So looking at those youth and senior bands. How do you plan out your season? This is going to be really important because it's going to let you guide the development of the individual player and how it aligns to what you're planning for working with the group. So here, it's a very complex tool. I could do a course onto itself just to dive into this, but see a lot of color coding. There's a coding at the top, and we talk about the physical loading just below. A lot of the color bars there, you can see them just in here. The part there talks about what each of the color codes are. The session structure, what the focus is on a given day. It goes day by day across, and then it goes into your weeks and months as you go across the season. So this gives a very high level overview of what you're intending to do for the season. And having these sort of planning tools is important because it'll let you plan out your roadmap for the individual development plans that you're looking to deliver. If there's any questions in terms of the tools at the end, you can always email me and I'll be happy to provide some of these tools back to you. So the roadmap, how does this work specifically in individual development plans? So there's going to be 6 key checkpoints that we really focus in on here today. So preseason team meeting, I'm sure we all do that. This is where the team will set objectives. This is an opportunity as well for you to gauge what the mindset is towards what some of these objectives were, maybe how last season went. It's also an opportunity after that's conducted to provide self-assessments back to the player. And we'll talk a bit about that as we go through the presentation. There's the initial assessment. So this is more along the lines of the player assessment. So you as a coach now are going to assess that player, and we'll talk about tools on that side, but actually looking at them technically, tactically, socially, physically, whatever benchmarks that you use. These could look like physical tests like your yo-yo intermittent test. This could be your 4-second acceleration test, zigzag test. For technical side, it could be a framework that you've defined on certain skills and behaviors and what they should look like, and where the player is against those. This all occurs again, ideally in the preseason point. And now after with that assessment, you'll be able to conduct individual meetings with the players, leading in with them and providing them now that information back. So now you've seen their self-assessment, you see where they are against your assessment, and now we can have a conversation around it. It's important to have a mid-season checkpoint, at least one. You can have more, but at least you have to have one. And the reason for this is it's going to allow for you and the player to sit down and decide, is it working? Is what we defined in that preseason checkpoint actually working? Are we hitting our targets? Are we approaching our targets? Are we way off the mark in our target? And do we need to adjust? It's kind of the conversation I was having at the beginning there was a lot about pivoting, and pivoting is something that we need to be prepared to do, and that mid-season checkpoint will allow us to get the information we need to do it, if possible, or if needed. The last bit's the end of season team and individual meetings. This is kind of the year in review. Did we hit our targets? Did we achieve what we wanted to achieve? If we did, great. What allowed us to do that so we can repeat that? And if we didn't, why weren't we able to do that? And what do we need to do going forward to adjust it? Very collaborative in approach, but an important piece. And that's with the players. The last piece of year in review, and this is more with the staff, club hierarchy, engaging with, if it's relevant, you've got a sporting director, manager, or at the very least, you're working with your assistant coaches, S&C coaches, or fitness coaches, and just collaborating with them on the entire season. So looking back at that periodized plan, your curriculums, did we achieve what we wanted to? What really worked, what didn't? Because these shouldn't be fixed documents. They should be living pieces, living documents that you're constantly adjusting and improving year to year based on the group of players that's in front of you. So the assessment tools themselves, I'm sure this burning question, what could I use to actually achieve this? So we wanted to highlight a holistic approach to this. And for example, for grassroots players assessment, I won't focus too much on here, but just wanted to highlight, there's a 4-corner approach that we tend to focus on here in Ontario and take. And we try and give the players feedback across all these areas because we feel it's important to develop that individual beyond just the technical, tactical. There's the physical components that we're looking at, the psychological, and those two tend to be more addressed. And one of the most underlooked, which is starting to gain a lot of traction in the football community at large across the globe, is the social emotional piece. making sure that this is addressed, that their experience is positive, very, very grassroots focused. And again, I know that's not the case for a number of you, so I won't dwell too much here, but you can see some of the things that you might work on in these areas. You'll assess the players on their dribbling. How confident are they? And thinking of specific game situations and where that's relevant. Looking at their coordination, their balance, their agility, their physical literacy, really. How does that allow them then to grow? Because the more physically literate they are, they'll be able to learn those more sports-specific skills as they progress into the levels that most of you are working at. So looking now there into the youth player assessments, this is going to be more relevant to the group here. So one thing that's really important is that it's measurable. You see score there. I know the font's a little small, but have a look. The scale there is 1 to 4. There's defined parameters as to what a 1 is and what a 2 is. And it really, the percentages you see in terms of frequency of execution. So for example, if we're looking at turning efficiency under pressure, their ability to turn with an opponent immediately on their back, if they're able to do it 80% of the time with success or more, you would rank them a 4. If they're able to do it a third of the time, 1 in every 3 times, you'd give them a 2 based on that scoring piece. This isn't finite. You can customize your own. Some have more comprehensive scales, some have narrower scales. One piece of advice I would give is try and stick to even numbers. Even numbers are critical because it avoids you sitting on the fence as a coach, or if you're leading coaches, it avoids them sitting on the fence. They have to go one way or the other based on where the player is. Here's an example of a deeper tool that's used. We deploy it here in one of our provincial programs, which is a technical, it's a four-corner assessment, but there's 134 criteria. It's pretty expansive, probably too expansive. We've talked about dialing it back a number of times, but you can see some of the descriptors there. The optimal body shape, vision and awareness, moving on angles, and getting detailed here will allow you to assess those players in those areas, but it provides clarity back to the player as to where their gaps are. Just at a quick glance, they can look at and say, well, anything I got below a 3, I may want to focus in on, or anything I do have a 3 on, I want to really make a 4. And those 4s I want to keep there. So having these tools available and developing them based on your club's DNA, your objectives, your vision of the game is going to be paramount importance as we move further into this process. And don't be shy of taking someone's tool, like these, for example, and ripping them apart and making your own. I think that's kind of the beauty of it, and that's something personally I've engaged in my entire coaching journey. Big piece, though, you're looking at development or performance benchmarks, and this is really going to depend what level of youth you're working with. So I would say if they're under the ages of 15, 16, there's still going to be a high focus on development, but now you're providing performance measurables between that age of 13 to 15, 13 to 16, still focusing on them developing those tools. North of 16, there might be a little bit more of an emphasis on the performance benchmarks, still allowing them the room to develop, because as we know, players continually develop. The adage that, at 21, a player was done and dusted, we realize that's no longer the case, and there's still constant opportunities to learn beyond the foundational pieces that are important to play the game. Another example of a tool, simpler, you'll see it's a different scoring method. This is deployed in another one of our provincial programs. It's scored 1 to 3, similar percentages in terms of the frequency of the certain habits, but you see some text below each of those corners. And that text is kind of a guide. It says, make sure that you're assessing the player in those areas. Those are really important components based on the age stage you're working with, based on their position, potentially, based on their role within the team. And these will be tailored, again, back to that DNA, that game model that we talked about earlier at the beginning. For senior player assessments, it's very metrics based. You're probably not going to dive into the real granular about how you receive a ball. It's going to be looking at the outcomes a lot more. I encourage you to put it more on the player to come to you as to how they might go about doing that. Especially if you're dealing with a senior at a professional level, these players will feel they have a foundation. They won't look too kindly initially unless there's a very strong relationship already built between the two of you on you coming down and trying to teach them how to take a free kick, for example, as we all saw Ronaldo and Benitez have in the news. That was a story that ran quite aggressively across. But again, building on the metrics based, you can look at metrics across their position and their specific role, their unit. So within the unit, it could be a number of individuals working towards hitting those targets. So for position example, it could be a striker in terms of shots on target. But the unit itself might then look at the total amount of chances created. So each individual is contributing to that total, regardless of their role on the team. And this keeps people on tasks, whether they're starters or subs. And similarly for the team objective. So based on what we want to achieve as a team, how are we going to go about doing that? Having these measurables or performance metrics are going to be key, that each individual across positions, across units is all funneling towards and building towards. As you can see, it's very performance oriented. Unfortunately, I don't have a sample to show you because most of these are proprietary, so can't really sell this out. But if you are working at a club, or if there's a club in your immediate neighborhood that you do know, try and tap them and ask some of these questions. And even if they don't give you exactly what their tool or metrics are, they might give you an idea of what they look for and how they look for it. So looking at feedback tools, so that was looking more at the assessment and how you can structure the assessments in your training and your match environments. But now, what about providing that feedback? So part of this, as we talked about, is going to be that self-assessment piece in the preseason and building those goals. It's important that you set goals, but the goals have to be specific. Thinking about the player's role, their age stage, and if you have that reference point, look at their previous performances, look at their previous learnings and how they've tracked. So be specific with what they can do going forward. It has to challenge them, and we'll talk a bit more about that shortly, but it shouldn't panic them as to what's coming. It has to be measurable. So don't focus on something very subjective. We hear things like, oh, we need to work harder. Well, what is work harder? Can we define work harder? Is it more high intensity sprints? Is it more running distance over time, covering more distance over the course of the match? If on the physical side, if it's technical and winning more 1v1 duels, successful dribbles, find those measurable metrics that you can look at and pull out of a match or a training environment and give back to the player that information. Because sometimes these are blind spots for both parties. Like I was saying, get them in that challenge zone. You don't want them comfortable where it's too easy, they're going to hit it within 2 weeks. But you don't want it to be impossible. A player that's only managing to get, imagine a midfielder that's only creating 2 chances by breaking lines with forward pass a game, asking them to make 10 a game immediately might not be achievable. So doing it in digestible chunks. And remember, you've got that mid-season point where you can go back to and up it if you need to, if they are hitting those metrics. And the players will enjoy that because it brings a bit of that gamification, that gratification that I hit this target, here's a new one. I hit that one, let's go for another one. Keep it relevant, try and make it appropriate, keep it on target and relevant to them, so to their reality, not necessarily something we look at. We'll talk about it a bit in the grassroots side, for example, of things that aren't necessarily relevant, but the biggest one is time-based. Make sure you have your checkpoints and your targets, and you're meeting with them to talk about this. And this could even just be done in an informal conversation, pitch side, during a session, after a session, at a water break. It's a bit of a challenge to keep 15, 20 plus of these individual development plans in your head. But if you know you're working on a specific target that ties back to their individual development plans, make a note of it in your session plan and take that 30 seconds just to have that sideline chat with that player. It can be very, very impactful to remind them of something that they've committed to and that you're committed to helping them achieve. So big question, what do they want? A lot of times these processes are coach driven. So think about that post-team meeting piece we talked about. Try and engage them in the process, make them feel part of it. So by them doing that self-assessment, maybe providing them that same tool to review themselves, they're feeling engaged. Similar when you're setting your team goals, and this is a bit of an aside, you can do the same thing. You might have a framework of what you want to achieve, but if you let the players engage in that process, they'll likely arrive at the same answers. And with the right questions, you can always guide them towards where you're hoping them to get. But that engagement will increase buy-in 100%, and you'll deal with less of some of the the potential drama that you feel in the change room environment. Try and build them out. What the player wants, how does it tie back to the team goals? So it's important to create that connection. You may need to do it more overtly, but if you can get them to now they realize, okay, this is what the team's trying to achieve. How do I support that? What is my role within that? Especially with your elite youth and senior players, this is going to be paramount framing of how to go about this. Like I was saying, you engage them. And this is the bigger piece. It's a chance for you to connect with them, really connect with them. They'll feel empowered because you're giving them this, and they have a bit of ownership in this process. And we won't dive too much into this, but we'll talk a little bit at the end about transformational behaviors and how that connection piece is important as well. Last one on the goal setting, make sure we're structuring it in 3 key areas. We're looking at the outcomes, the easy piece, as you can see there. The performance feeds that, and the process is really where the energy and attention needs to go. So you see there, for example, a striker might want to achieve the top goal scorer award. Great outcome. Them scoring goals is going to help the team. If it's attainable, we can put it there. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, they might take a minimum of 4 shots per game, and it has to be on target, for example. How are we going to do that in the process now? Well, we're going to work on shooting at least 10 to 15 minutes, 4 times per week as a training add-on. So they might stay a little bit longer and work on some finishing exercise just to achieve that. You see another one there for a midfielder. They want to improve, they want to contribute with assists. So they want to be involved in that chance creation. So looking at that, they might want to improve their passing efficiency by 10% going forward, if you want to be specific. So that they're connecting those passes and being a key link there. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to measure that in training. We're going to improve that passes forward in training by 25%. In those training sessions 3 times per week. So notice here you have the frequency of how it has to occur, the measurables, what specifically you're measuring, how you're going to measure it, it's there. The performance benchmark is there, how that process feeds that benchmark, which will help us lead to the outcome. And as the coach, you're always driving process, not the outcome. The focus isn't on the outcome. The outcome will be a product of the focus and the work put into the process. And the performance metric is a reminder of how it's tracking. Is it working? Are we achieving what we need to? Maybe our process is incorrect and we need to pivot it. Maybe it's working really well and we need to up the ante in the performance and outcome. So diving into age-specific tools. I won't spend too much on the grassroots tool, but some key elements of a grassroots tool. We want to keep it simple. Don't avoid adult vocabulary. Use things that they can relate to. Movie characters, traffic lights. You do want to keep a focus on 4 corners, but some players might not be cognitively prepared to handle what some of these things are. So really focus in on the corners that are digestible and make sense to them. Us as coaches, we can still work on things on the back end, but what we're presenting and working with them on has to be something that they can relate to. The rule of 3. Never surpass more than 3 items in a given section. It becomes a bit of an overload. If they're younger, I would say even less. You might look at just 1 or 2 if they're in that 8 to 9 age group, for example. And don't add something that's outside their control. So thinking about that relevant piece that we're talking about, them being on time for training, for example, is not necessarily within their control. It's their parents that may be driving them or their guardians. And by adding that, some measurables such as that, they can put pressure on their parents, but ultimately they can't control whether they get there on time. So all we're doing in that instance is creating an environment to increase anxiety and stress, which won't benefit their learning or experience overall. And this could look like this. So I tend to favor a traffic light system. I think it's easy for players to understand. They understand the stop, start, go. You can shift the colors around. There's some debate about whether start should be green or it should be or yellow because of the continue. It depends how you want to frame this or highlight. And you may only have 2 of these and not all 3, for example. But this is an example of something. Distracting teammates at practice might be relevant for that group. Shooting more, keep when close to goal. Try to use your left foot. On the continue side, we want you to keep trying to beat defenders 1v1 because they're really going for it. and they're very talkative in games with their teammates. Keep doing that. So you're trying to encourage certain behaviors, create new ones, and maybe curb others. And for example, in that stop, you have the distracting teammates at practice. You as a coach might deploy different leadership strategies in the session to make that happen, but this is what a tool could look like for the grassroots. And we used little Ronaldo here in Sporting as an example. Giving their photo or a club logo, some sort of branding and imagery is very powerful for young players, for all players really. Looking at a youth tool, this will be a bit more relevant, and I've divided the youth into youth at your base level. It could be recreational, could be at your initial, maybe local, regional level, and then more of an elite tool, which focuses a bit more on the academy side and performance-driven pieces. Some key elements that are going to be important here is you're going to have an event history. So looking at, if you're rating them set in their sessions, making sure you have that session history. What were their ratings across sessions? Having that piece. What are the ratings based on? What is the scale? These are all important pieces to include. Still, a focus on 4 corners, because again, it's that base area. You're looking at those learning outcomes, and it should be drawn from your curriculum specifically based on the age and stage that they're at. Give them that scoring, emphasize that number scaling again, keep it even. I've given you an example of what you can name them. It's proficient, competent, developing, and emerging. But again, world is yours there. It's your oyster. You can manipulate that and tweak it to however you see fit. And then always leave a spot for some additional comments, because you want to maybe add some context to something that maybe isn't fully captured in that 4-corner review. And you just want to highlight that they're doing something exceptionally well. You've noticed something, or you've noticed something else that you really think they need to focus on that wasn't captured in those areas. And the tool could look like this. So you see they've got the session history in there, some basic information about the player, whether they're living up to certain behaviors that exist. Again, logo piece. The 4 corners, you can color code them. Simple at a glance allows you to see and the player to see what's going well, what necessarily isn't. The scoring. And then here you'll see some descriptors of what might go in here, similar to the tool that I showed earlier. So for a goalkeeper, they might look at some of these behaviors across each of these corners, and you have those built out based, again, curriculum, your game model, and your approach to the game. So how does it differ maybe to an elite tool? So there's some key elements here. They might start looking a little bit more at the matches themselves. So there will be reference to whether they were a starter, sub, or unused in specific games, how much time they played, the score lines in those games. That cultural review becomes of even more importance about whether they're living those high performance behaviors. And that was that bar graph we just saw. And those staff ratings might be overtly shown now, as opposed to just kept it for record on the back end. And depending on the age group and the level, you'll shift, or you could even do both. You might have this as a 2-page document where you'll have one focusing on the 4 corners and another one focusing on the 4 moments. We'll look more at the 4 moments when I show you the senior tool example though. And here you might have next steps as well, what you're planning to do with the player from here. Maybe for us, for example, in a provincial program, next steps for us might be we're recommending that player into professional environments or into a national program. Sorry, let me just dive back here so you can see this. The tool's a little bit different. Like you see, you're going to have their ratings in a camp or in a training environment, their ratings in specific matches, that next steps we talked about, that cultural review, as we saw, was an above the line in the last one, some of the match details, and similarly. But as you can see, I've played with the formatting, so you can customize this. It can look however you want. This was built in PowerPoint. Some of you might use Word, etc. No one way to go about this. So looking at the key senior tools, you've got your match stats. The reason that you might have substituted them will be included now. Well, why are they coming off the field if they're coming off the field? Because this is important for them to start understanding is there a recurring issue, and that legacy data piece we're starting to build over time is important. Much more of a tactical focus, so that 4-moment review. There's going to be details on sports science now, because likelihood we're going to have some of that technology, GPS trackers, heart rate monitors. We're able to monitor them across these areas, and that's going to be helpful. average staff ratings are still important. And again, we're looking at that 4-moment review. And as you can see, it's shifted slightly. It's now 4-moment, not 4 corners. Looking at attacking organization, the 2 transition moments, your defensive organization, how does that all fit in? Because now you're looking at performance-based behaviors and you're tying this back into metrics and measurables. And we can see that, for example, reflected in terms of the sports science. How are they actually adhering to nutrition, recovery, hydration? These are pieces here. How are they responding with their attitude to certain activities that they need to do, whether it's prehabilitation, whether it's injury prevention protocol that they might have specific to them. And similarly, are they leaders in driving the culture of the team? Are they party goers? If they are, that bar is going to be low. If they're not, it's going to be high because they're living and breathing the behaviors. They're setting them by example. And these are all little things that you can capture in this sort of document. And again, it doesn't need to be as simple as 1 page. It can be far more expansive. But match stats, just to highlight there, and you can do this even for the youth tool, these can be included here. So you can just add a simple section at the bottom that says a performance metric that's relevant to them. It could be 1v1 efficiency if they're a wide player. It could be passes forward if they're a midfield player. It could be chances created or taken if they're an attacking player. It could be ball recoveries if they're in the defending side. So there's flexibility here about how you might build this across those areas. So diving now into process. So how would that work? Let's revisit the roadmap. So we saw now that we can implement some of these tools. So those assessment tools are really going to come in your stage 1, because you can ask the player to execute the exact same assessment you did as part of the self-assessment. And then your initial assessment comes in here. So those feedback tools could be interlinked. Preseason individual meetings now is just tying this all together. This is your kind of checkpoint to tie steps 1 and 2, as we've seen with some of these tools. Mid-season, now, is it working? Is it not? Can we pivot like we talked about? Always referring back to the tool, back to the targets that were set by the player, by yourself together. And now at the end of season, similarly, looking at it, what worked, what didn't. And now with all this data, you can really make that year in review assessment more impactful, because all these measurables are there. All these checkpoints are there. You had the discussions. You now have a good idea of how a player performs and how they react to this protocol. Are they committed? Are they pushing towards this? Did they drop off mentally? Is it something that now you need to focus on? Or if you're dealing with a higher end, again, youth or pro setup, maybe it's time for that player to move on, and those tough conversations might need to happen as a result. But now you actually have the information and the data to back that sort of decision or conversation up. But how would you execute it at those checkpoints? I'm sure some of you have already been thinking about this question. So looking at the resources that you have available to you, technology is going to be a big one. So the more technology you have available, the more meaningful this can be, whether that's a strap on the boot, like a player maker sort of tool, which measures technical attributes, or whether it's just a GPS tracker for those older players, or whether something as simple as you're filming your sessions. You're filming your training sessions, or at the very least, you're filming your matches, and you're taking the time to go and tag that, either as simple as a tool as Windows Movie Maker or iMovie on a MacBook, or whether you have tools like Huddle, Sports Code, Game Breaker, and things of that sort. But these things cost money, so try and tailor your process based onto the resources that you or your club have available. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Focus on something that you can actually deliver on with what you have. The big one is time. So how should these look? How much time does this take? Well, I think COVID's taught us all that we can do a lot of this virtually. We don't need to do it pitch side. We don't need to necessarily do some of these in person, but I would still encourage a lot of these feedback meetings, and we'll talk about that right in the next slide, to occur in person. If they can't, the video piece is important. Seeing each other and getting that feel for one another is an important human element that we should try and keep intact if we can. If we can't, though, due to time, phone call suffices. I know for a provincial program here in Ontario, we've done that before with 10 to 15 minute phone calls with players across the province, because it just isn't feasible to do it any other way. Another one to look at is the culture that you're going to be creating. What kind of culture do you want to create? Looking back to the accountability piece, are you creating that mindset? Are you creating that opportunity for players to commit to something? And it's not just the commitment to the team or to their teammates or to you, it's to this process. This really, really focuses in on the process. So even when there may be a bad result on a Saturday, it won't impact and derail everything, because the focus is still on how we're working to achieve those outcomes gradually in our day-to-day. It isn't always tied to that outcome, even though we know what our desired outcome is. That's not where the focus is. That's not where the investment of energy and emotion is tied to directly. The other piece is going to be important, and I've highlighted already, self-assessment. I'd encourage you to do it harder with younger players, but with youth players, it's really important to really allow them that opportunity. Where do they see themselves? How do they see themselves based on the metrics that you've provided, based on the measurables that you're going to look at? It also provides that valuable information where you might be surprised as to where you think they are. They might think they're way better in a certain area than you do, and vice versa. You think they're great somewhere and they really don't. And that provides a bit of a guide as to what you can talk about in your feedback meeting. So, talk to me a little bit about why you think your turning isn't great today. I really want to get some insight here. And then they can explain it to you. And now you have an opportunity as a coach to shed some light onto why they are better, or they're giving you some insight into something maybe you haven't considered. And your role here isn't to dictate. It's to facilitate and support. Like I said at the beginning, the title wasn't by fluke, it was by design. You're trying to support their journey, their experience. Ultimately, we've had our opportunities to play, or we still keep playing in a different level. This is them now. How do we help them be better? How do we help them progress through this system, progress through this experience? And this is going to be your role as a facilitator and a guide, really as a role model in this process. So the feedback meetings themselves, in terms of timelines, if you're going to give them that self-assessment, give them a week. Give them a week to do it prior to your meeting. So your meetings, well, we're meeting right now on the Thursday. I give you your self-assessment now because we're meeting next Thursday. Give them a week to fill that in. Make sure that you get it ahead of time. And this will allow you also, I would encourage you to provide your assessment to the player ahead of time. By doing this, you reduce the amount of time that's required to actually deliver in a feedback meeting. And the feedback meeting then becomes less about reading off a document to give them an understanding of where you see them, and more about engaging as to what they understand, don't understand, where there's maybe some discrepancies as what they see as the assessment, or what you might see as their own self-assessment. So duration, you can keep it to about 15 minutes. Some will go longer, some might need half an hour, and that's really going to depend. But most often than not, in my experience, 15 minutes sometimes is all you need to get across. And thinking about how you deliver this, again, it can be done through Zoom, like we just said, phone call. But if you have the opportunity to do it in person, do so, making sure you set the room up and set the stage in a way where it's a conversation. You're not behind a desk. Remove objects from between the two of you. And this is going to facilitate more of a positive mindset and psychological stimulation that's going to help guide the conversation, keep it positive. Think more coffee table, fireside chat, angled chairs, where it's all about that discussion. As you can see there's no obstructions, and there's that opportunity to really look at each other in the eyes and see each other's body language throughout. Ask a lot of questions. Don't be quick to just come out and say, yeah, you really need to improve your passing efficiency. Ask them a question about it. How do you feel your passing, your efficiency in passing is contributing to the team's performance? And they might come to you with the answer immediately and go, well, yeah, I do feel that I can improve here. This is an opportunity this season for me to really focus on that part of my game. Drive it in questions. Obviously, it's an art form to ask these questions, and it takes time to build that comfort level. But once you have it, it'll be helpful, and you won't have to rely on directly reading off the pieces. Even engage them. Is there anything that stood out to you on the assessment piece? Did you find any differences between my assessment and yours? And you already have done that pre-meeting, but again, giving them the opportunity to take lead in this process. If it's a mid-season meeting, you're gauging whether you're on track. Do we need to adjust? Do we feel it's working? Is the process working? Do you feel that we can enhance this? Always driving it in that light is going to be really important, especially with older, more mature players. With younger, sometimes they need a little bit more hand-holding and guidance in the process, but they may surprise you. So don't be afraid to try and ask the question. They may respond a little bit more maturely than you think. And the last bit is just the question, how can I support you? What do you need from me? What could I do differently to make this better for you, to allow you to perform better? And obviously, as the demands of performance go up in the footballing sense, for example, at the senior levels and the youth academy levels, it may be harder to drive those types of questions, but doing this again builds that connection. They recognize that you value them as not just a player, but an individual, and that you recognize that they have something to contribute to the group. Whether that translates to them continuing with the academy or the team in the following year is a different discussion, but we want to engage them and keep them connected to everything throughout and help them while they are with us. So in conclusion, just some highlight points. This could be a course on of itself, transformational coaching. I'm just going to throw a citation there. So you can find this online if you just Google transformational coaching behaviors. You can find these documents. They're by Dr. Jean Cote and co. But if you look at the 11 behaviors that are listed here, just by engaging in this development planning process with the player and in some of the strategies that I've outlined for you throughout the presentation, you're going to hit 9 out of 11 of these behaviors. The idealized influence is the only one where it's not, because it's talking about you being a role model. And you can achieve this in your day-to-day, or you could even achieve this by just sharing some of your own learning and goals that you have as an individual. And that will check off those 2 boxes. But if you've got questions on this or you'd like resource on this, again, don't be shy, ask for them, and I'll try and get those to you. The last piece I want to leave you on is on the hierarchy of competence. I'm sure a number of us have thought about this, but it's just something to really think about as coaches and technical leaders. We're going to go through these as people throughout our lives in different areas, and we'll be at different stages in different areas of our own development. But that unconscious incompetence, we're not good at something and we don't realize it. So we're just unaware and we haven't started self-reflecting. So self-reflecting will be a key strategy to help us. A lot of us will be in that conscious incompetent phase. We are self-aware, we realize we have some gaps, and we need to try and experiment with certain concepts, certain tools like what we just talked about today, to build them into habits. So now you're shifting into that conscious competence. We're looking to build those habits, make it automated. So we're thinking about this thinking process. How do I do this? How do I bring this into my day-to-day? Oh, damn, I forgot. But that's okay. Stick with it until eventually we'll get to that final stage of the habit is formed. We're in a stage of unconscious competence. We're good at it. We don't even need to think about it. It's just happening. It's there. And the key question to ask yourself when you're finally at that stage is, what's next? Where do I go next? Because as I'm sure many of you have heard coaches talk about, getting to the top of the mountain is much easier than staying there. So once you get to the top, how do you stay there? That continuous learning process is paramount. So just to close off, I want to go back to this Mentimeter before questions. And then we can tie off. Just highlight 3 things for me that you've picked out of today's sessions. Good feedback for myself, and then I can tailor this because again, this is a living document that I'll keep adjusting as we go. So if you can log into the Mentimeter and submit that, highlight those 3 things. And at this point as well, open to taking questions as they come.